College football nerds, y'all knew we were going to talk about Ohio State this week. Come on, knuckleheads. And Northwestern fans, we're glad you're here for the ride, too. If you don't know, we get nerdy on this channel. We talk numbers. We have a pretty decent computer model, if I do say so myself, even though Josh made it, and I don't want to give him too much credit because he gets the big head. I got Josh here with me. We're going to talk about this game, but I want y'all to stick around, Ohio State fans that might not be as thrilled about this game because you're worried about the playoffs and all of that crap that's going on. We're going to make an argument for why Ohio State belongs in the playoffs and shut down this discussion, even with just the 5 regular season games. We're going to lay that all out. We got a couple of interesting points there that y'all should hang on even after the score prediction and model discussion. But before we get to that, Josh, why don't you tell us what the model says about this game? Talk about it a little bit in context with what Vegas is saying about this game, and then we'll talk off of that.
So we run a model that is based off your performance to date, and then it kind of builds an expectation for if both teams play their B-plus game, what does it look like? It's accurate more often than not. No model is perfect in football. It's a weird game with a funny shaped ball. But I think it does give a pretty good baseline, and people who have followed us long enough, I think, recognize that. And it gives you an idea of what you should expect going into it. And then we also kind of, we do some fun things with machine learning in the model to try to generate a score based off how your team, scores given the production that we're expecting you to get. It shouldn't surprise anyone, right, that Ohio State's expected to win in the model. I think the interesting thing is Northwestern is actually is merely a good run defense, 92% of opponent rush averages. Ohio State defensively is really not great in our model. 98% of opponent rushing averages, 108% of opponent passing averages, meaning if teams average 5 yards per carry going in, Ohio State's generally allowed 5, really allowing you to have your average day. The thing that sticks out like a sore thumb is Northwestern has 74% of opponent passing averages. It's an elite pass defense. That goes up against an elite passing offense in Ohio State with 10 yards per attempt. And as we talk about a lot, even an elite pass defense, elite, is 75%. You're going to get 3 out of 4 yards you normally get. So if you get 10 yards per attempt or 11 yards per attempt, which teams are doing now, you're still going to get 7 or 8. That's a good passing game in old-style football. And Northwestern just isn't very good. 3.8 yards per carry, 6 yards per attempt. It's not a good offense. 6 yards per play to 5 yard per play differential. And more importantly, Ohio State's offense is a lot more efficient in their scheme scoring. And that efficiency is the reason that you get a 40 to 25 model differential in Ohio State's favor. I will say, he mentioned Vegas. We were kind of curious about it. A lot of times we like to look at the Vegas line and over under. Vegas does not inform our model or our picks, but it's an interesting sort of thing to make sure we're being sane. Our model's more or less in line with it. Vegas has Ohio State by 21. The over-under is currently at 59, based off what I'm seeing. Our model has it 15 and 65. Basically saying Northwestern is about a touchdown higher than they should be in our model. So it's saying it's more like 40 to 17, not 40 to 25. That's the Vegas line. But that's kind of where our model is. That's the Vegas expectation in this game.
And I don't know that Northwestern fans tuning in are super shocked to see this. We did a championship game a couple years ago with them, and it was a similar situation. Kind of stressed offensively with a really good defense. So we were looking through, thinking about the Northwestern results this year, and obviously there's some surprising things there in terms of like the Michigan State game, where Northwestern is clearly a better team than Michigan State. How does that happen? I don't know. But if you look at all of their games, the one thing that's really consistent is they play really, really good defense. The first game of the year, they also played seemingly really good offense. For Ohio State fans who didn't get to play Maryland, I think it's an interesting game to dissect. So real quick, why don't we go through the Maryland game and touch on something we noticed there of how maybe that game was a little bit fool's gold, but why the numbers are important.
Maryland is an interesting team because they are a downfield RPO team in a conference that's mostly not adopted those principles yet. Ohio State is an RPO team. Penn State has a lot of RPO principles. Indiana is somewhat there, but they're more just vertical air raid kind of attack, and I wouldn't call them RPO personally. But Maryland is a true RPO team. I mean, Loxley's offense is entirely predicated, especially off the slant RPO run, almost like his zone read. You're either going to hand it off or you're going to throw over the linebackers. It was interesting because Northwestern destroyed them 43-3 in the opener, and we were kind of trying to figure out why. And one is it was the opener, things were weird, COVID, I get all that. But we also tend to say, sometimes there's weird results, but a lot of times these things are more explainable than you think. There are two things that happen in that Maryland game. One of which is very real world, and one of which is more numerical. The real world thing is, I think Northwestern is good enough defensively that they can hold point in the line of scrimmage and drop the defense. Already established Northwestern is an elite secondary and an elite defensive backfield based off their 74% numbers. And you can talk about whatever you want player for player. They play at an extremely high level. Pass defense, they're probably one of the best in the country, at least statistically they are. And because of that, when you play an RPO team, if you can sync and cover those RPO concepts, sometimes that breaks down. Alabama under Loxley did this several times. Georgia game, they did it in the Clemson game. If you can hold the line of scrimmage where you're giving up some rushing yards, but you're not just getting destroyed by the run, while at the same time dropping a linebacker or playing tight man coverage where you don't allow that slant throw, then the offense can't generate any consistent passing. The offense that's doing that RPO play tends to throw into traffic a lot because now the receiver redirected or there's a linebacker in space. And for example, Talia threw 3 interceptions in the Northwestern game. And because it's so dependent upon the RPO pass for chunk yardage, if you're not running the ball at a good clip in spite of that, you don't get first downs. If you're running 4 yards a carry, 5 yards a carry, the numbers may look good, but it needs the pass yardage to complement it because 4 or 5 yards per carry is not enough in that system to move it because you're going to have a lot of pass plays, and those pass plays will end up becoming incompletions, and 4 yards and incompletion to 4 yards is a punt. Talia was 14 of 25. He was 3.8 yards per attempt, only 94 yards passing in that game. I think that's the story of it. And because they got caught in that cycle, the real story behind the story numerically, Northwestern ran 83 plays. 83. Maryland only ran 49. So 4.2 yards per play from Maryland is not horrible. It's not good, but it's not horrific. But in that RPO scheme, that's only enough for 3 points. Conversely, Northwestern 6.5 yards per play or 6.47 really isn't that fantastic. Northwestern actually averaged 7 against Illinois and only scored 28 points. And we're not talking total yardage here. So I know there may be short fields and all that stuff. We're talking about per play. They were less effective than they were in the Illinois game. But the sheer number of plays gave them opportunities to score and they put points up. And especially because Maryland sort of wore out because the offense couldn't move the sticks. I think that's really interesting in this game for 2 reasons. One, I'm not sure how much of a fluke that is because Northwestern offensively was sub 5 yards per play every game from between the Maryland and Illinois game. They were under 4 yards per play in everything but the Nebraska game. Iowa, Purdue, Wisconsin, Michigan State, all sub 4 yards per play. That's really bad. The second thing that's interesting, and I think this is more an observation I'll be looking at in the Big Ten championship game, looking towards the playoffs, is that Northwestern has shown that they're actually a good defense against RPO teams. Ohio State has feasted on the RPO in the passing game throughout this year. I'm going to be really curious to see how well Ohio State's passing game really does translate in this game, because if they can throw the RPO here, that's going to give me a lot more confidence they'll be able to do it in the playoffs. Whereas if they struggle, and let's say they score 30 points in the game, they win 30-10, if they've got to work 4 quarters to get 30 points, that's going to have me be a little bit more concerned that maybe they're not going to be the 40 to 50 point juggernaut that they have been in the playoffs when they're facing a Clemson or an Alabama that probably is going to get 40 points realistically against Ohio State's defense.
And I think that the point here is really subtle, and maybe not so subtle, but Ohio State fans. I don't want to say this at the risk of really frustrating Northwestern fans, but I think there's a chance that maybe not quite that margin, but that this Ohio State Northwestern game is that game in reverse, in that Ohio State is the one that's able to kind of exert their will on Northwestern's offense because Northwestern doesn't do the types of things that are uniquely capable of exploiting the Ohio State defense. If you can't stress the corners of the Ohio State defense, they can shut you down. I'm not looking at the final score of this game. Like, I almost don't care about the final score of this game. And I don't think Ohio State fans should care about the final score of this game. You're going to win this game. You just are. This is not an LSU-Florida situation. You're going to win this game. We don't, like, yes, we care about the championship, but we care about also how you're going to fare in the playoffs because you're going to the playoffs. And what I want to see is, or what I want to warn Ohio State fans is, don't look at the score. Don't wake up Sunday morning and say, man, we won. We beat a good team because Northwestern's a good team. We beat a good team 37-10. And so we're in good shape. What you want, because if you can have that kind of play disparity, you're going to get points regardless. And it's not necessarily a reflection of how good your offense is. It could be a reflection of the fact that you just had 89 plays to their 49. You did get short fields, and just over the course of time, you managed to score the points. What I want to see is 9 yards plus an attempt from Justin Fields. I want to see 4.5 yards an attempt running the ball because, like you said, Northwestern can hold point there. So I don't need to see them run it up 6.5 yards a carry, 250 yards. But if we can see an explosive output offensively against a really good defense, as you said, that can challenge a team schematically with RPO, then I'm encouraged. And I don't care about the score. I care about the yards per attempt. Because then, Josh, and you can speak to this a little bit, then I'm less concerned, ironically, about the Ohio State defense because at least I know that if they have to get in a shootout with somebody, they can at least hold serve and have a chance.
The real thing that just sort of shuts it down for me in this game is I don't see where Northwestern is going to be able to score. For the reasons you said, Ohio State has their issues. They're not as talented in the front seven. They're not as talented in the defensive secondary. They've got good players. They've got good players on the line. They've got a lot of options, if nothing else, at linebacker. But it's not quite the same thing. There's no Chase Young on this roster. The secondary certainly doesn't have the super high-end NFL starters that they've had. But the thing that really has hurt Ohio State the most, I think, is the fact that teams can get the corners in isolation. They have that single high look, and we've been railing on it for a few weeks. We don't think the single high safety look is going to really translate to the playoffs because I don't think you can go one-on-one with a Devontae Smith or, Amari Rogers and Powell at Clemson maybe. Notre Dame has more options than I think people give them credit for, but particularly Alabama. I don't think you can go one-on-one and win those battles enough. Northwestern can't stress it. You can go single high safety and beat Northwestern. So it really, to me, just kind of comes down to the fact of how is Ohio State's offense going to translate in this game, and what does that mean for the future? And if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and give my score prediction. I see this as a 34-10 game. I mean, I think Ohio State is going to kind of win by default, almost. And I'm going to be nitpicking it to see how the playoffs translate. But at the end of the day, I just don't think Northwestern has any way to put Ohio State out of their comfort zone. And those issues where Ohio State has had, where the safety can't cover sideline to sideline, and the corners get beat, like Wade, who struggled as a true corner, an isolation coverage rather than a safety. Northwestern doesn't have a single guy that threatens you in that way. And because of that, I think it's more just about seeing how the offense translate. And I will say, if Northwestern plays the game I expect, Northwestern's going to leave themselves with a small box, and I think they've done this a lot this year, where the numbers for the run game may be 4 or 5 yards per carry, And that's going to look pretty good, and they're going to run it some. But they will take that because in the modern era, if you can give up 5 yards or 4 yards per carry while still dropping guys, you can take away the RPO and you can keep teams under 30 points, which is what Northwestern's been doing. The only way to do that is to leave yourself somewhat susceptible to the run. But the trick is, can you do that and not give up 6 to 10 yards per carry? A lot of teams, when they try this strategy, they just get broken by the run and they have to give it up or they get exhausted. And that's the game that I'm going to be watching within the game.
For me, I think that we are going to see an Ohio State team that's motivated to try to make a point for the playoffs. And I think that they're going to. I think Northwestern is a very good defense, and we've seen Ohio State in the past, even last year, really struggle early against a really good defense, but ultimately have enough to get theirs in the end. I think they're going to get theirs plus. I'm going to go 41-13, Ohio State. And my number, I asked you this number in the Alabama game. Like, what's the point total to Florida that you need to see to be really excited about Alabama's defense being for real and not just playing crappy offenses? What's the yards per attempt from Justin Fields that if you see that against a Northwestern, your ears perk up a little bit and you think, okay, Ohio State might be about to go on a run?
I mean, Northwestern has not allowed 6.5 yards per attempt. Let me repeat that. If I don't know how much people are stat junkies watching our channel. Northwestern has not allowed 6.5 yards per attempt in a game.
That's crazy.
That's nuts. A large part of the country averages 8+ now. So I think for Ohio State, it's probably the number's somewhere between 9 and 9.5. I think if they're at 9.5, I'm going to be seriously wowed. But I think even 9 yards per attempt is probably going to persuade me that the offense is going to play really well in the playoffs. So that's about the number I'd like to see. 9. And then if they're at 10+, I'm going to be seriously impressed. If they're in the 7s to 8s range, I'll say I expect them to finish in the 8s. Let me be clear on that. I kind of expect them to be somewhere around 8.5 to 9. And so more or less than that is going to be whether they're above or below my expectations.
All right, so it's rant time from me. And I want to talk about the playoff situation, assuming Ohio State wins this game. We've had a couple of coaches, high-profile coaches, come out lately and take shots at the notion that Ohio State's going to get to play in the playoffs with only 5 regular season games. And Dabo Sweeney at Clemson said something earlier this week about, they're not playing enough games and that he thinks a 2-loss Clemson should get in over them, which is patently absurd. Dan Mullen said something yesterday, and I tweeted about it. I was really frustrated that he said this. He said something about after the LSU game that, maybe we should just play fewer games like other conferences are doing, and then it wouldn't be a problem. Well, you still got to beat Alabama. And you still, all you had to do was beat 3-5 Florida, and you still control your own destiny. 3-5 LSU. This is absolutely ridiculous. The fact that people are complaining that Ohio State didn't play Michigan and beat them by 50 points. Like, here's the thing. I do think there are some real benefits for Ohio State that aren't fair because they're playing 5 games, in that they don't have to show any tape offensively or defensively again in most of these games. Had they played Michigan, they'd beat them by 40 points, and they still wouldn't have shown any tape. Had they played Maryland, they'd beat them 43-3, and they still wouldn't have shown any tape. So Clemson, who gets to skate through most years playing, honestly, 5 games worth of starters because they're sitting everybody, and they love to brag about how they get to play their entire depth chart, which means you're not playing those games either. I don't know what the difference is. But you made a really good point when people were complaining that Ohio State gets to play in this game on Twitter. And I want you to talk about that as we get into this discussion about how it absolutely makes no sense to not have an undefeated Ohio State team in the playoffs.
In particular, I think you're referring to the comment I made about the Big Ten championship game.
Yeah, and the losing to Michigan.
Right. I have zero issue with the rule change. And this is the way you have to explain it because it's really simple. Ohio State was guaranteed to make the Big Ten championship at 5-1. Ohio State was disqualified at 5-0. So under the old rule, 5-1 was better than 5-0. And that's just facially absurd. It made no sense that Ohio State could make the Big Ten championship game, and then if they won it, the playoff, by forfeiting to Michigan. If Ohio State, under the old rule, if they hadn't changed it, if Ohio State just made out a statement and said, we hereby forfeit the Michigan game, they would have been in the Big Ten championship game, guaranteed, if that counted. And then if they win the Big Ten championship game, even with that one loss, if you look at the landscape of college football, that forfeit would have absolutely not kept them out of the college football playoff. So the whole thing to me was absurd. One, it's really clear that the old rule didn't make any sense. You can't say an Ohio State team that lost to Michigan was worse than an Ohio State team that hadn't played Michigan. That's like saying the Florida State team, or I'm sorry, the Ohio State team that loses to Michigan is better than the one that didn't play. That'd be like saying Florida, now that they've lost to LSU, is better than Florida was a week ago. That's what the rule was doing. And then moreover, even if they lost that game, they were still going to end up in the playoffs if they won the Big Ten championship. It was really irrelevant from that perspective. But I think the biggest thing with the playoff landscape is you have to talk about what teams did, and you have to talk about what the rest of the landscape is, right? So the first thing, responding to Dan Mullen's comments, this was another thing we were going back and forth about. Look, I think Mullen may have a point if he wants to complain about the fairness of playing in the playoffs versus teams that played fewer games. That Clemson and Notre Dame in particular sat out the week before the ACC championship game. You could complain about the fact that if I face them in the playoffs, they haven't played as many games recently, and that they took an unfair advantage. Or maybe teams that didn't play as many games in the season had an unfair advantage in the playoffs once you're playing the games. But in terms of earning your way there, to me, those arguments about fairness and how it hurts you in the playoffs actually has nothing to do with the fact that Florida needed to win that game. To me, Florida losing the LSU game just justified the fact that they needed to play LSU, because clearly that wasn't an automatic W for Florida. And anyone that's watched Florida's defense and the way they played this season wasn't necessarily shocked, because they'd had a number of 2-score wins. Florida fans have been up in our comments for several weeks because I refuse to rank them ahead of Texas A&M. And they keep saying, well, we're elite. Look how good we've been playing. I'm like, great. I don't think A&M is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but they beat you, and you need to acknowledge you've got a lot of faults. You're not a perfect team. But that also leads into the next thing. I think from a lot of Big Ten fans and a lot of fans around the world, and I say Ohio State fans are actually probably among the more reasonable fans we deal with in a lot of ways. And I'm not brown-nosing there. I'm actually serious. But even them, I think a lot balk at the idea of A&M being a potential playoff team. The problem with everyone that talks about that from any angle is absolutely about the landscape of college football. It's easy to rag on Texas A&M as a playoff team, but dadgummit, they got one loss to the number one team. They got a win over a top 10 team. They played a difficult schedule. Who else has that resume? Because resumes this year are rough. And anytime you want to complain about Ohio State and how many games they played, you'd have a good argument if there were multiple undefeated teams in other conferences that played 12 games. If the Pac-12 champion was USC and they'd look dominant, and they maybe even if they were 11-1 and they played multiple ranked games and dominated people. But they played the same number of games Ohio State did. The Big 12 teams all have 2 losses. And in that landscape, frankly, it's not that hard to be a playoff team this year. And in that landscape, Ohio State has a perfectly good argument, in my opinion.
And this is where it comes full circle, and I want credit from Ohio State fans because we are intellectually consistent. They really hammered us in 2017 and 2018 because we said Ohio State didn't belong in the playoffs, even though we did support them being in the playoffs, and you can't look at outcomes and say, well, Ohio State didn't belong in there over Penn State because Penn State won the Rose Bowl, Ohio State got killed in the playoffs. That does not work. I hate when people do that. Ohio State absolutely in the regular season deserved to be in the playoffs over Penn State. I don't care, even though Penn State won the conference championship. We're being intellectually consistent in here in saying that one of the faults, either 2015, 17, or 18, that Ohio State fans employ is they look at 2015 or 2017 that got left out. And then they go across years and say, well, Alabama in 2018 got in under these circumstances, or another year, 2015, whatever. They got in under these circumstances, and we didn't. Therefore, the committee has no criteria, and conference championships don't matter, and they did matter, now they don't. No, it's what happened that year. The entire context of the whole season matters. We keep saying this. 2018, Ohio State absolutely gets in 2017 with that resume. We're saying the same thing this year. It just happens to support Ohio State. We're making the same argument. The teams and resumes change along the way. Ohio State belongs in, and I do think that we do catch a lot of flack for the Texas A&M debate, and they haven't looked great, which is another thing that we're consistent on. We look at your wins and losses and how you play in them against certain teams. If you play a bad team close, you're going to get dinged by us if you're also coming to the table and saying you need a shot you need to be in the playoffs. And so we're looking at the whole thing. I'm not upset about the 7-point win over Indiana when they were healthy and when it was a blowout until the end of the game. And like you said, it's not just that Ohio State only played 5 regular season games. It's that Ohio State has their resume and how they've looked. And then we have all of this garbage around them. So it's like, okay, if you're saying Ohio State isn't going to be in the playoffs, and let's for a moment take Texas A&M off the table. Who are you putting in there? Because it's not just that team doesn't belong. And people do that with our rankings all the time. They're like, oh, that team's overranked. Okay, who are you putting ahead of them? Who are you saying, gun to your head, is better than Ohio State? Because if you swap schedules, do you think Ohio State doesn't go undefeated with Cincinnati's schedule? It's not Ohio State's fault that they only played 5 games. And for the record, they were the ones stumping to play a full season, to play football at all in the Big Ten. So are you going to gun to your head say Ohio State wouldn't be undefeated with Cincinnati's schedule, or that Cincinnati would be undefeated with Ohio State's schedule? I don't think you can say that. Furthermore, given that they're both undefeated, are you going to say that Ohio State wouldn't kill Cincinnati or CCU or Georgia or Oklahoma or any of these other teams? The only one being Oklahoma that I think give them a shot. So I think that Ohio State fans should at least appreciate that it's now come full circle. And the same arguments we were making that hurt them in the past, we're intellectually consistent on, and they support them now. And we're going to stick by it. Ohio State, if they beat Northwestern, not only belongs in the playoffs, they belong in the 3 seed, not the 4 seed. I don't think they're, and that's what I would love for your thoughts on, given how everything's going to shake up. If they beat Northwestern, do you think that not only they're in the playoffs, but they're not the 4 seed?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I want to give clarity because you talked about the different years, and I want to give a specific example to sort of tie people to the point you were making. And it's at 2017, I think there were a lot of Ohio State fans that got irked because this non-conference champion Alabama gets in the playoffs with a loss, whereas in 2015, one loss Ohio State did not make the playoffs after they lost to Michigan State. The point that you were making is the situation of 2015 was different than the situation in 2017 because Alabama only got in 2017 because Ohio State had 2 losses. You get in on your own merits, but you really get in based off whether someone else that year has a better argument than you did. 2017 Alabama does not get in the playoffs very many years. They wouldn't have gotten in the playoffs in 2015. They wouldn't have gotten the playoffs in 2018, 2019, 2020. But 2017 was kind of a unique year where they got in, given their faults and given the rest of the landscape of college football. And the thing that I know where you got this brought up on Twitter was particularly with Florida, because Florida now has 2 losses. And Florida, even if they beat Alabama, they're not going to have an argument over, I don't care how many losses Ohio State has. Ohio State is still undefeated. Or not how many losses, how many games they played. Ohio State, undefeated Ohio State, even with few games, still has to be ranked ahead of a 2-loss Florida, even if they beat Alabama. It's all, you can look at previous years for how teams are ranked within that year and maybe take something away from that. But don't don't ever take, one loss non-conference champion gets in this year. Why don't they get in this other year? It's like, well, because there were 4 undefeated teams this year and there were only 3 teams with 1 loss this other year. Because that's literally what's happened with conference champions. Every year you're compared against the other teams in that year. You can't compare it to teams in other years. But beyond that, in terms of seeding this season, I think if Notre Dame beats Clemson again, I think Notre Dame has to be the 2 seed. And I know they've beaten the same team twice, but they've run, they have actually played 11 games. That is worth something from seeding among teams that are all equally undefeated. They've beaten a top 10 team twice. And it may have been the same team, but it's still a good record. They still beat Miami, who I don't actually think Miami's that good. Sorry if any Miami fan manages to listen this far in a video. I don't buy Miami. There's a reason they haven't been in my top 10 for a long time. But I think Notre Dame ends up number 2. If Clemson beats Notre Dame, personally, I think I put Ohio State above Clemson. Now, it's really irrelevant because you're going to end up with Ohio State and Clemson is 2-3 and Notre Dame 4 in that scenario. So it doesn't really matter if you're 2 or 3, especially since Alabama gets the preference of bowl anyway. So it doesn't even matter for bowl site. But I do think personally I would put an undefeated 6-0 Ohio State over a 10-1 Clemson, because I think going 1-1 against a top 10 team, 500, it just means you did a coin flip. But yeah, I don't think an undefeated Ohio State should ever be lower than 3rd. I don't buy the argument that even with 1 loss that A&M should be ahead of them. I do think there's a sneaky argument right now, and I'll bring this point up, which is a little bit of a side point, but would you agree with this? I have no issue with Clemson being behind Ohio State with fewer games, but you want to rag on A&M. The only reason A&M is behind Clemson is the perceived quality of A&M versus Clemson if they played head-to-head. A&M played a tougher schedule than Clemson did. A&M has a much better win than Clemson has because A&M beat Florida, who's a better team than anybody Clemson beat by a mile. And A&M has a better loss than Clemson had because Alabama is better than Notre Dame. A&M has the better wins, the better losses, the tougher schedule. The only reason they're behind Clemson is it's perceived that Clemson would beat them on a neutral field. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, A&M has a better resume. But for us, and the way we look at things, A&M doesn't necessarily have a better resume because we ding you equally when you struggle against crappy teams. So I think all in all, Ohio State fans appreciate where we're coming from. And we had to claw back this perception that we're just SEC homers stumping for Alabama in 2017 or whatever. And that's okay. They got left out in 2018. Texas beat Oklahoma by 3 points, and then Oklahoma avenged that loss within the same season. That is not comparable to losing by 30 points to an unranked team. And that's the great thing about where Ohio State is exactly what we said when Ryan Day took over. You're going to lose those. You're going to get rid of the knucklehead losses. And that's what you had under Urban Meyer. Supremely talented teams, knucklehead losses, and then seasons like 2015 where you're supremely talented and you beat 6-loss NIU 20-13. They got rid of that. All right, we're super long on this. Any other final points before we wrap it up?
No, really not.
Yeah, we cover. For us to extract 35 minutes out of Northwestern Ohio State it's a lot. So, but y'all hang on with us for the rest of the playoffs. We'll be doing some videos here and there that aren't just previews, and I'm certain that Ohio State will be involved in some of those. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.